Pints with Jack, Season 4, Episode 84, Bonus Episode, Learning with C.S. Lewis, the Art and Faith Podcast with host Libby John. So recently I was invited by Libby John to come onto the Art and Faith Podcast to talk about Lewis and some of his influences and our favorite things about him. And it was a wonderful hour. A gentle conversation where we talked about such things as creativity and the effect of community. And of course, we touched on the marvelous work of Diana Glyer and the company they keep and Bandersnatch, and looking at creativity, collaboration, and how community is so important for that process. We looked at the creative community between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and also looked at the kind of arc of their friendship, and saw there a model for our own friendships, what we might learn from them and apply to our own lives. As always, Lewis has so many practical helps, and that's, I think, what keeps his writings really fresh and helpful, evergreen as the years go by. And so we explored some of those. We also delighted ourselves in the Chronicles of Narnia and looked at the fact that they came relatively late in Lewis's career, and as such, I think, serve as some of his most mature work. I don't think we should dismiss them as fairy tales. I think that we should embrace them as such and see them in some ways as culminating so much of Lewis's thought, especially about the things of God and the things of creativity and imagination. So it was a delightful time, and I hope you enjoy this episode. And it's almost as if we have been imprisoned in a world that is trying to sell us the counterfeit and keep us from love. And so we should escape. And sometimes reading fairy stories are ways to teach us to face our own dragons.
Welcome to Art and Faith Conversations, where we dive deeper into creativity, culture, and our spiritual identity. I'm founder of the podcast, Libby John. This week, I am joined by my guest, Andrew Lazo. Andrew is an internationally known speaker and writer, specializing on C.S. Lewis and the creative writing group Lewis gathered with, referred to as the Inklings. Andrew and I have a great conversation as he shares his wisdom and thoughts on what he's learned from studying Lewis for so long. We talk about imagination and the church, why the Narnia books are some of Lewis's most mature works, and we talk about what we can learn from the way the Inklings challenged each other, not only as a literary group, but as a community of deep friendship. Along with his studies of Lewis, Andrew is currently attending Virginia Theological Seminary, preparing for priestly ministry in the Episcopal Church, and he's also pursuing his doctorate in the Romantic Theology program at Northwind Seminary. Whether you are familiar with C.S. Lewis's works or not, I think you're going to learn a lot from my conversation with Andrew, just as I did. And you'll be inspired by the hope and joy and love that we find threaded all throughout C.S. Lewis's books. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. Thanks for being here.
It's such a joy finally to meet even virtually, face to face. I know we've got a lot of connections, and I'm excited about spending some time with you today.
Yeah, well, I know you and I were just talking pre-show how we've been indirectly crossing paths, and I think we've known each other online for a little while. So yeah, it's great to finally sit down and have a conversation, which you're joining us from Florida. Is that right?
I am. My wife's family is from Sarasota, Florida. And so while I'm in seminary and still have my time is still my own before I graduate and head to a parish somewhere, we want to spend as much time as we can with the family. And because our seminary from the pandemic is mostly Zoom-based, I was able to come down here. So I've got a final tomorrow and a final due on Tuesday. And so
oh my goodness.
That'll be done.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, I know you're an expert in all things C.S. Lewis, and can we call you a scholar? Isn't there like certain qualifications for that?
I don't know what they are, but I'm claiming them. I've spent a lot of time on Lewis and discovered a manuscript that was in the archive at the Wade Center at Wheaton College. And this was almost 10 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago now, and transcribed it from Lewis's own handwriting and published it for the first time. And it turns out that it was Lewis's first spiritual autobiography.
Yeah, wow.
So now I kind of see my name pop up and now and then when people are talking about his different conversions. And so, yeah, that I think, though, my favorite title when it comes to Lewis studies is amateur, in the lovely French sense of, a lover. And I just owe Lewis so much. And so it's always a joy for me to delve in.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to draw from the deep well of what you know of his works to talk about community and creativity and how cultivating our imaginations with stories like the Chronicles of Narnia is essential to our spiritual formation and art making.
I absolutely, I think that's why Lewis continues to be such a draw for people, right? Mm-hmm. And when you talk about cultivating and collaboration, all of these names like Diana Glyer and Lancia Smith's Cultivating Project and Anselm and the Redeeming of the Imagination. And I think that Lewis in some ways is kind of our guide, our pioneer in those lands. And I think of Lewis as not only a door, but a doorway, right? And so as a scholar, he's, I love studying him, but the ideas that he opens us to are doorways that we walk through and the connections that he makes. And so I think that he would be often just as glad as if we forgot about him and talked about the better things that he inspires. So I think we're right in the wheelhouse now.
I love thinking about it like a doorway. Well, how did you first encounter Lewis's writings, and what led you on this path to specializing in studying him?
Well, in some ways, I feel like I'm just kind of repaying a longstanding debt. Lewis says of George MacDonald that he owes as much to him, Lewis said, I owe as much to MacDonald as one man can owe another. And that's how I feel about Lewis. First encountered him as a child, had a wonderful imaginative aunt who would send us marvelous books. And this was long before I became a Christian, and found something stirring in Peter's nobility. And it turns out that what attracted me in all of that was what I would later discover was called a holiness, a purity, a righteousness. I didn't know about those things. We never went to church, but I knew that I loved what I was seeing. When I became a Christian, I reread the Narnias and felt quite proud of myself to have discovered that there was Christianity in the Chronicles of Narnia. I can pause for a moment of surprise if you'd like.
Okay.
But it was actually when I was in the music business community in Nashville, Tennessee. I was traveling as a road manager for Phil Keggy, the amazing guitar player. And Phil was an inveterate reader, had gotten his GED while he was on the road with a rock band. And so he always felt compelled to read as much as he could put his hands on. And he was going through a real Lewis and Tolkien period at that point. And I was going through a crisis of faith where I really wasn't seeing the kind of depth in Christianity that I was hoping for. And I realized now that the shallowness was perhaps not the Christians around me, but the Christian inside of me. And I thought, if there's not more to the faith than this, I'm going to sleep in on Sundays and make up my own rules. Well, Phil handed me wisely a copy of Letters to an American Lady. And that got me started on the adult Lewis, which I had never read at all, and soon stumbled across Surprised by Joy. And that really showed me that I had not thought about that Lewis had thought through his atheism better than I'd ever thought through my Christianity. So I rolled up my sleeves and thought, I better get to the bottom of Lewis. And now in my 50s, I feel like I've barely even started.
Yeah. Wow, what a story. Well, I wanted to hear from you about what you've learned from studying Lewis's tight-knit group of writing friends, the Inklings, to kind of dive into community a little bit. And so maybe just first quickly describe what the Inklings or who the Inklings are, just for those who don't know.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and fortunately, I get to stand tiptoe on the shoulders of giants. Diana Pavlik-Glyer has done marvelous work on the Inklings. These were in early 1930s, a group of friends centered around C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and a number of others. Owen Barfield and soon Charles Williams would join. Neville Coghill, Cecil Harwood. There were in total 19 Inklings. They met roughly between 1930, 1931 to the late 1940s. And they had a fondness for each other's company. And so they settled into a pattern of meeting every Tuesday late morning for a pint of beer at the Eagle and Child, a pint or two or a three or four. And then on Thursday evenings, they would tromp up the stairs in new buildings in Magdalen College there in Oxford to Lewis's rooms. And they would read their manuscripts aloud to each other. Lewis had a passion for being read to and an incredible verbal memory. And so they would read their works to each other, and then they would, as they said, go at it hammer and tongs. And so creatively, they would criticize and enjoy and appreciate and laugh. And so that was how books like the Screwtape Letters, All Hallows Eve, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, these were all written within the company of the Inklings. And they knew that they were reading their works aloud to each other. And because of Lewis's passion for being read to, and because of the camaraderie of the group, a lot of great creativity came about during those Thursday evenings, and a lot of great laughter on Tuesday mornings.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've heard it said great art is not created in isolation. And so I think we can see from just the Inklings, that played out. And I was just wondering what you have learned about the communal nature of creativity by studying the Inklings.
Yeah, boy, I owe them so much, and I owe their process so much. And I mentioned earlier the work of Diana Glyer. She spent 23 years reading every word by every Inkling.
Wow.
And that's 365 books and every essay and poem and letter. She's certainly the world's expert on them. And then she wrote a book called The Company They Keep, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien as Writers in Community, where she kind of exploded that very myth that it's not the lonely artist in their garret, painting away, but it's the interaction. And you see that about a lot of great artists' life, that they need each other to play off of. The very last picture we have of Vincent van Gogh is him sitting on a beachside cafe, at a beachside cafe with Emile Bernard, and his back is towards us. But he and Bernard are vigorously engaged in conversation. And so Diana does a marvelous job. She's done kind of a How to Do What the Inklings Do edition of the company they keep called Bandersnatch. And that's rapidly amongst at least my community, becoming a verb. Have you bandersnatched that? Have you taken your rough draft and worked through it with somebody else?
Yeah.
Comes from a quote when somebody asked Lewis if he had influenced Tolkien, and he said, "Influence Tolkien? You may as well try to influence a Bandersnatch."
I love it.
But certainly their community of love and their demand for good writing. These were all literary minded people. And sometimes Lewis would say, "Better, Tolkien, better." And Tolkien responded two ways to criticism. He ignored it, or he threw away his chapters and he started all over again.
Wow.
So Lewis's influence was part of this kind of outgrowth of love. And so they created community. And I think that's such a marvelous model.
Yeah. I mean, isn't it even kind of said we wouldn't have The Lord of the Rings without Lewis?
Tolkien himself, in fact, said that. He said if it weren't for Lewis's constant encouragement, The Lord of the Rings wouldn't have been started, finished, or brought to publication. And Lewis had a passion for story. And Tolkien had these genealogies and geographies and maps and languages. Tolkien thought of himself as a historian, as a scientist even. And Tolkien remarked later to a friend, Jack, he had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet. Jack was Lewis's nickname.
Yeah.
And so that great narrative kind of came out of Lewis's encouragement. And then, of course, Tolkien really helped Lewis see that, and the idea had already started, but Tolkien helped bring into focus the role of mythology in relationship to the gospel. Tolkien was an ardent Christian when Lewis was an atheist, and their friendship around Norse mythology really kind of led Tolkien to speak truth into Lewis's life at a time where he really could hear it. So we wouldn't really know one without the other. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a marvelous testament to their friendship. In fact, I carry in my pocket a stone from Addison's Walk, which is where Lewis and Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, another Inkling, had a long night talk that led directly to Lewis's conversion. And I keep this stone, I call it an Addison's Rock, keep it in my pocket to remind myself that God can change the world through a handful of people loving the things they love. And that's a lesson I need every day.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, this polarizing world we're living in right now, and I know conflict is not a new thing, but I feel like we're in this culture now where you can't even have a challenging conversation with a friend. But, we see with Tolkien and Lewis, they disagreed about things and that sharpened each other. How can we cultivate that kind of deep friendship and collaborative, creative community still today, and then even in this digital world?
Absolutely. I think you put your finger right in the heart of it, Libby, that there's this culture of disagreement. And I think that I'd go farther. I'd call it a culture of hatred, that we have permitted ourselves to hate those that we don't share opinions with. And I think that we are overdue to hear the advice of one of Lewis's great heroes, G.K. Chesterton, who said of his brother, we argued all the time, but we never sunk so low as to quarrel. Mm-hmm. And I think that if argument and disagreement and challenging each other redemptively is a gift, I think Screwtape, I think the devil would love to twist that gift and turn it into hatred.
Yeah.
Lewis said of another intellectual opponent that to find an enemy is almost to find a friend. And I think that we need to return to that attitude. And frankly, I think the only way that we can do that, especially in our politically, polemically charged climate, is to begin with a heart of love and to return to the challenge to love our neighbors as ourselves. It doesn't at all mean agreement, but it does mean curiosity. It does mean seeking the best. It does mean giving credit for good intention to even to our enemies. Now, of course, let's be wise as serpents, as Jesus said, but let's also be innocent as doves about them. And I think that the key to do that is to deliberately challenge ourselves to love, not necessarily to feel affection, but to want the best from anyone, especially those with whom we disagree. And that might help to season our disagreements with salt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know when I listened to some of the other talks and stuff you've given on Lewis's works, you always talk about how they come from places of love, and you're able to find that and draw that out.
I think that was, well, of course, it's the two great commandments, right? To love God and to love neighbor. And then I think, and these are kind of the capstone core values of my seminary training and my future ministry as an Episcopal priest. Once I finish seminary, I think struggling with it's what Lewis calls the intolerable compliment that God loves us, right? Mark 10 reminds us that Jesus looked at the young man, the rich young ruler, and loved him. And to grapple with the love of God and then try to deal in love with one another, I think needs to be the starting place of all things. Because Christian theology says that God created out of an abundance of love. He created people so that he could lavish love upon them.
Mm-hmm.
And if we are indeed created in the imago Dei, in the image of God, that creative nature should always be love aimed. But that takes deliberate doing in the days and ages that we live in, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wanted to transition a little bit to the work and role of our imagination. And, I see that as like such a gift of love that God gave us these imaginations, and it's kind of the mark of our humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people are probably most familiar with Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia books. So I wanted to ask, what is your perspective of the role of the imagination and fairy tale type stories? What does that play on our spiritual formation?
Yeah, I think fairy tales perhaps have been given short shrift. In some ways, they have fallen out of fashion. Most of your listeners are those who can love and appreciate fairy tales and who resonate with Lewis in the preface to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the dedication to Lucy Barfield, his goddaughter. He says, "Someday you may be old enough to start reading fairy tales again."
Yeah, I love that.
And it's important to realize that the literary genre of the fairy tale isn't written necessarily for children. It's written for people who like that sort of thing. And if you liked it as a child, you'll likely like it as an adult. And so I think that they get dismissed as juvenilia, but I think there's great power. The editor of Christianity Today, Carl F.H. Henry, famous American theologian, wrote to C.S. Lewis in 1955, right after he had finished writing the Chronicles of Narnia and Till We Have Faces, actually. And evidently asked Lewis for more theological articles, the kinds of things that he had written in the 40s, the apologetics, and books like Problem of Pain and Mere Christianity and Miracles. And Lewis writes him a short note saying, I can't write your articles for you. My thought and talent, such as they are, now flow in different, though I think not less Christian channels. And I do not think I am likely to write more directly theological pieces. And Lewis underlines that word in his letter. If I am now good for anything, he goes on, it is for catching the reader unawares through fiction and symbol. So Lewis's indirect theology is fictional, symbolic, imaginative. And that's why I often will say that I think that the Chronicles of Narnia, and especially Till We Have Faces, are Lewis's most mature work and perhaps his best spiritual statements. He was finally trading in the genre that he loved the best, which is one of narrative and fairy story and myth. And that's him speaking his native tongue, I think.
Yeah, I heard you say that. You think they are some of his most mature works. And so obviously, if you just look at it on surface level, you wouldn't think that. But to draw out, why that is, that's really interesting.
And I think the challenge too, and I'll challenge your listeners, if it's been a while since you read the Narnias, it's worth reading them again. The older I get and the more widely I'm educated, the deeper those books get. And there have been a load of recent discoveries about just how deep those chronicles were, and some of the heretofore unrecognized designs undergirded those books. And so there's certainly a lot of magic happening there, and it's worth trying them again if you haven't read them in a while.
Yeah. Well, do you think the church has gotten away from valuing this role of our imagination in our spiritual formation? And do you think that possibly contributes to a crisis of faith we see a lot of, especially artists, tend to experience?
It's that word church that trips me up. And Lewis in The Four Loves says the challenge for a critical mind is not to praise or dispraise, but define and describe. And so, yes, there certainly are elements of what you're saying. And a lot of times artists feel like they have to leave the church in order to be honest to their imagination or their creative gifts. And I just think that that's the devil at work. I think that the enemy is trying to twist both church and creativity. But I also see marvelous things coming out of the church to this day. And Andrew Peterson in the Rabbit Room and some of the wonderful things that they're doing are examples of the church really sponsoring, stirring creativity. I was just watching a video yesterday, famous bass player named Leland Sklar. Lee Sklar has played for everybody. I mean, Phil Collins and Hall & Oates, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. But he also has played with Phil Keaggy in the second chapter of Acts, and he did a whole episode on his YouTube channel about Phil Keaggy and his marvelous creativity. And he played some songs. There's marvelous art coming out in the church. And of course, the historical church, the Protestant Revolution is kind of a young newcomer in terms of the church. And so there's marvelous artistry, cathedrals and paintings and things that have been done to the glory of God, wonderful music in the past. And so I think the enemy would certainly love to tamp those efforts down or to twist or distract them. But I actually think that the church, because they're in touch with the Creator, have in some ways drawn a bead on creativity. And you still see, I think, marvelous art being done. I have hope anyway.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I'm seeing so much more happening than I ever have before, and including all art forms, not just music, like it was very music heavy in recent decades, but seeing even dance and film and just more art forms being integrated.
It's the C.S. Lewis Foundation, based in Redlands, California, has long been a sponsor of the Oxbridge Conference and in Oxford and Cambridge in England. And there's another one coming up this coming next summer, the summer of 22. And the founder and past president, Stan Matson, had this marvelous commitment to dance that you seldom see in evangelical circles. Yeah. And so at every conference, they would find groups of faith-based dance groups. But Stan Matson has really kind of been the founder of a feast of the arts. He's brought Bruce Herman, the wonderful painter from the Northeast, from Massachusetts, and Jack Redford, who's done fabulous orchestrations in Hollywood, done scores and scores and scores of TVs and movies. And it was at the conference that Malcolm and Bruce Herman, or that Jack Redford, Bruce Herman, and Malcolm Guite, the fabulous poet, got together, and they put together a project called Ordinary Saints, where Bruce painted portraits and Malcolm wrote poems, and Jack Redford did orchestrations of them. Wow. And a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, at Laity Lodge in Texas, they debuted all of the paintings with a string orchestra and Malcolm reading his poetry. And so I think that the church has sponsored wonderful sacred art, and they continue to do that. Yeah. Wow. Well, how are works like the Chronicles of Narnia or even Lord of the Rings an antidote to the despair we see right now and experiencing in the world right now versus being an escapism? I love that word, escapism. And or maybe is that a good thing? I don't know. Well, and once again, Lewis and Tolkien being deeply committed to language would certainly start by saying, what do you mean by escape? But even before that, I think that Churchill's advice is good. When you're going through hell, keep going. Yeah. Right? That when it comes to despair, we're going to find it. Our Lord promised it. He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. And, I just finished writing a paper for Northwind Seminary for my Inklings course, arguing that the Inklings were in some ways the same kind of literary modernists that the James Joyces and Virginia Woolfs and T.S. Eliot's were. And part of it is because you see so much despair in the work of Tolkien and Lewis. If you look up hopeless and no hope, that's what characterizes the trip up to Mount Doom. The trip through Mordor was hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. He says that again and again. And certainly both men had gone through World War I. Orwell, Until We Have Faces, is despairing. You look at The Last Battle, and that's full of despair. But at the end, after Frodo and Sam are lying there on the mountain and the world is blowing up, the eagles come. And at the end, as Narnia comes crashing into the sea and all the stars fall from the heavens, there's Aslan at the door looking at people with love and welcoming us into his country. And so I think that there's no out but through. But when it comes to escape, actually, Lewis has got a fantastic poem. And in thinking about this before our conversation, I looked it up again. It's a poem that has been called The Prudent Jailer. And in the latest critical edition, it's called The Romantics. And I'll read just a couple of verses if I could.
Yeah.
This is Lewis responding to the charge of escapism. He says, always the old nostalgia? Yes. We still remember times before we learned to wear the prison dress and irons made our ankles sore. Still, when we hear the train at night, we envy the free travelers whirled in some few seconds past the sight of the blank walls that bound our world. Escapists? Yes. Staring at bars and chains, we think of files, and then of dark night muffling moon and stars, and luck befriending hunted men.
Wow.
Lewis and Tolkien's idea of escape, and Tolkien in On Fairy Stories, which I recommend as highly as I can. It's kind of the manifesto of the Inklings. And Lewis quotes from it. Tolkien wrote it on Fairy Stories. There's a marvelous annotated edition edited by Verlin Flieger and Douglas Anderson, easy to find. And it's kind of a 90-page essay on the role of fairy stories. And Tolkien says that the goal is recovery, escape, and consolation. And escape, not trying to escape the world. And any of our listeners who have read fairy tales know that there's darkness there, sometimes far darker than our lives contain.
Yeah.
But escape, as being somebody like in Lewis's poems, had been wrongly imprisoned. And so escape is the only faithful act. And we've been sold a bill of goods in our society. If you look at what people are trying to get us to buy, none of those things will make us soul happy.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if we have been imprisoned in a world that is trying to sell us the counterfeit and keep us from love. And so we should escape. And sometimes reading fairy stories are ways to teach us to face our own dragons. Chesterton talked about that. Lewis did too. And so escape not as escapist, but escape as looking at the reality that the false reality that I have been pitched, and saying, no, there's another world. There's a new Jerusalem coming down someday. And yes, the moon will turn red and the stars will fall from the sky and the hearts of men will grow cold. But there's a better world coming. Charlie Peacock said, I want to live like heaven is a real place. And Puddleglum says, I want to live like a Narnian even if there is no Narnia. Well, there is a Narnia and it's coming. And we should try to escape the dark lies of this world if we will be faithful. And to me, fairy tales are a great way to start to learn the vocabulary of proper escape for improperly imprisoned people.
Wow, I love those very hopeful words. Well, I know that You are in seminary, like you said, and for somebody who already has a lot of credentials, tell us just about that calling that you felt, kind of this later in life calling.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you asking. It's been something that I've grappled with, and I find out now as I'm about to become a professional Episcopal priest that there's even a name for it. It's called the call narrative. And so we work up our shorthand versions of our call narrative. For me, and Kristen always points this out, when I was teaching English at a Christian high school, a couple different Christian high schools, marvelous work. But the part that really thrilled me was the chance to get to talk to students or to pray with a colleague and or to talk about the sacraments and to talk about the Eucharistic nature of giving a cup of coffee to somebody who might come to visit my room. Those are the things that thrilled me. And so I began to wonder if I was talking about the sacraments when I should have been talking about misplaced modifiers and dangling participles. Maybe I should find better work.
Yeah.
And an Episcopal priest friend, dear friend, encouraged me to maybe see if I could find ways to make my desire to teach, but my desire to speak the truth of the gospel, see if I could make those things come together better. Those kind of two oppositions really met in a quote that I found was given to me by a friend from Frederick Buechner, marvelous Presbyterian writer. And he says, the place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet.
I just posted that on Instagram.
Oh my goodness. I don't even think I saw that in your feed. Yeah. Or maybe that was what inspired me. And I love people and I love language and I love the gospel. And so it seems like professional ministry might be a place to at least try to get close to those things. So I mentioned it to Kristen, and she was strangely warmed, to borrow that Wesleyan phrase.
To go on that adventure.
Yes, and so we moved in 2019 to Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. It's one of the best Episcopal seminaries. And I've been a bunch of things. I'm an Episcopapticostitarian.
Wow.
And there's a part of me that will always love the evangelical tradition and part of me that will always love the liturgy. And so, so I was asked by my bishop to go to Virginia. I found out during that time that Walter Hooper, who was C.S. Lewis's secretary in the last year of Lewis's life, Walter himself had attended that seminary in the 50s. Walter, now of blessed memory, just passed away, but it's nice to look around and think Walter might have been here.
Yeah.
And I'm also actually part of Northwind Seminary, started by Rob Duncan and Michael Christensen. Michael Christensen, well known in the C.S. Lewis world for his book on Lewis and Scripture. And in their retirement have started an online seminary. And so I'm pursuing my doctorate in theology and ministry. And doing it, the program is called Romantic Theology. So working on Lewis and Tolkien and Barfield and Williams, the Inklings, with a wonderful cast of folks. Kristen's at Northwind as well, my wife, pursuing her doctorate in spiritual formation, working on Henry Nouwen.
Oh, wow.
So that's a couple of different seminaries. And yeah, it's going to throw some more letters behind my name, but it also, I think, give me some skills to see if I can make the love of God clear, which is kind of central to my vision of my own vocation.
Yeah.
To make it clear and to speak about love.
Yeah.
So that's where I am, as I've got a couple more finals to finish up.
Yeah. Well, we can definitely hear that voice of ministry and love come through in everything you're saying here today and what you're doing. So I've asked you if you could wrap up our time here with a blessing or a benediction to leave our listeners with.
Well, I have prepared something, but I do need to say that the blessing of the invitation and your gracious preparation of that have already been a benediction to me. and to know that there is out there in the Zoom land, in the podcast world, a hunger for these things, and to have been able to have some voice there. I've done some work with the Pints with Jack podcast, in addition to those marvelous folks at Anselm Society and elsewhere. So the benediction has come to me, and so if I can return a little back, I think I'm fulfilling an obligation.
Oh, thank you.
So I was looking through this marvelous poem that Lewis wrote, or that Tolkien wrote to Lewis while Lewis was still an atheist. Lewis made the mistake in Tolkien, who was an ardent Catholic all his life, made the mistake of saying to Tolkien that mythology was just lies, though breathed through silver. Tolkien said balderdash. And he wrote a poem called Mythopoeia, which is the two Greek words mythos and poema. Mythos means story, and poema, poem. It just means a crafted thing. And actually, I'm so touched that when St. Paul says that we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, that he has prepared for us to walk in. Workmanship is the Greek word poema. And any of our listeners, any of us who have tried to create something like a poem or a dance, we know that it's a reworking and it takes time and frustration. And we are God's carefully crafted thing. And so Tolkien wrote this poem to Lewis, and I'll end our time together with just a few phrases from that poem that struck me so well. And let this be our blessing. Blessed are the timid hearts that evil hate, that quail in its shadow and yet shut the gate, that seek no parley, and in guarded room, though small and bait, upon a clumsy loom, weave tissues gilded by the far-off day, hoped and believed in under shadow's sway. Blessed are the men of Noah's race that build their little arks, though frail and poorly filled, and steer through winds contrary towards a wraith, a rumor of a harbor guessed by faith. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. Such isles they saw afar, and ones more fair, and those that hear them yet may beware. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but oft to victory have turned the lyre and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now, and dark hath been, with light of suns as yet no man has seen. May that be our task and our hope today and in the days to come.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Andrew. You can find out more about him and his studies through his website, which I share in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening and sharing the podcast with friends and on your social networks, and also leaving a kind review wherever you listen to the podcast. It's the best way to support this work and help me continue having these transformative conversations as we continue to spur one another on through our creative acts and art making. Blessings, my friends, and we'll see you next time.
Well, I hope you found that as delightful as I did. And please join us again on Pints with Jack next time, when we will be going further up and further in.